Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. I hope everybody is staying healthy and safe at home and civically engaged. Today we are discussing active community ownership of transit agencies with Saba Long. Saba is the founder of Obelisk Strategies, which is an Atlanta-based public relations agency with a focus on civic and corporate communications strategy. With more than a decade of experience, she has provided communications expertise and numerous political campaigns and ballot initiatives. She has counseled startups and served as a liaison for the White House Advisory Panel on Infrastructure and Cybersecurity. Saba has also served as a contractor and a consultant for MARTA, providing media relations and executive communications advice to the then CEO Keith Parker. And she is a founding member of the MARTA Army, which is a citizen-led initiative to improve transit ridership experience in the Atlanta region. And we're going to talk more about that and learn more about that today. Saba has also served on the boards of the Atlanta Bicycle Coalition, PEDS, which is the Atlanta Pedestrian Advocacy Organization, and the Atlanta chapter of Young Professionals in Transportation. We are going to go through questions as we go, and we're going to have plenty of time for additional questions at the end. So I'd like to encourage everybody listening to feel free to enter your questions in the question box at the side of your screen at any time, and we'll make sure to get to as many of those as possible. And with that, I'm going to start off with a couple of questions for you, Saba. Can you just tell us a little bit to begin with about what MARTA Army is and how it began?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Alice and Eno, thank you all for having me. My name is Saba. I put my social media info here, Saba Long and MARTA Army. So just to give you an overview of what the MARTA Army is. So it was born out of Transportation Camp South in 2015. And at the time, I was a contractor at MARTA. I was focusing on communications. And we were brainstorming with the head of communications about, this question about how do we make MARTA cool? What do we do? And so we pitched that question to people at Transportation Camp South and said, hey, as an agency, we know that sometimes, MARTA can be seen as not as nimble as people might like, or they may feel like the public can't engage in the agency in a way that they might be interested in. So if we put the reins in your hands, so to speak, what could MARTA become? And so we empowered external champions to do that, right? So, if you're on this webinar, you know that, and if you follow on Twitter, people are already having conversations about what should transit look like? How can I improve transportation in my community? I want to have an ownership stake, but I don't always know where to start. And so what MARTA did was say, hey, we invite you into that conversation, right? We know that we don't have all the answers. I mean, we may not be able to move as fast as the public would like. And so if we invite the public to be part of that conversation and lead, then perhaps change can happen internally and externally. This happened only because there were internal champions that said, we are going to give MARTA Army, this external group, the autonomy to be innovative in a way that internally we cannot. And because of that, we build synergistic relationships. So one of the first things, I'll back up and say, internally on the comms team, we were talking about what this could look like with both the board and C-suite executives within the agency. And they were a bit miffed and, wait, we want to have a public external group do what? Right? I mean, it sounds like it's a bit bizarre, for a government group to invite the public to be so active in what transportation could look like. So it took some work to get internal buy-in. But one of the first things we did, and this is something I learned from Keith Parker when he was at MARTA, is to find quick wins. So the MARTA Army did one of its first operations around, it was called TimelyTrip, and it was about how to improve the bus experience. And so that led to other projects, and it showed the validity of the organization and that the public did have a role to play. And I'll pause there, Alice.
Awesome. Thank you. So you ended up making your case, but when you started out, sort of what were the conversations among the MARTA Army members? It's sort of a, you know, what was the purpose of founding the MARTA Army? What was your like initial problem statement, and what did you feel like you really needed to move forward? You know, was there this certain level of agency buy-in that you needed? Was it a certain number of engaged community members? And sort of how did you define that problem statement and then define your needs and figure out how to move forward from there?
Yeah, so I would say the problem statement was, how do we make MARTA cool, right? And this was at a time where, you know, this was shortly after Keith had taken over at MARTA. So there was a lot of shifts going on in the agency and in the region around what transit should look like. And so, you know, the recession had obviously certainly hurt the agency. And so this was a way to kind of almost reintroduce MARTA to the public. And then two, to say as a community of transit customers and riders, we want to bring dignity to the transit experience. You know, oftentimes in Metro Atlanta, unfortunately, transit is seen through a racial lens rather than through a mobility lens. And so we were hoping to kind of solve that issue and show that, you know, the MARTA brand is an iconic brand. You know, there are ways that we can rethink what transit looks like, whether that's bringing dignity to the bus experience, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, making sure that there are trash cans at bus stops, making sure the public understands what MARTA is and what MARTA can do, right? Sometimes, you know, the anti-transit or skeptical transit people will say, oh, well, transit doesn't take me where I want to go. And then if you actually look at the system, it actually can take you to where you want to go, but they may not. There's a disconnect for some reason between, you know, the public perception and then what the agency is actually capable of doing. And so it was, you know, part education, part a way to really empower people who really care about transit. I mean, there were a lot of people in the region who care about transit, and it's not just in Atlanta, it's in, you know, every city. I bet if you looked at the Reddit for LA or for Chicago or, you know, Minneapolis, you'll see a lot of people talking about how to improve transit. And so it's crowdsourcing those ideas, kind of building this groundswell of interest that's public driven, and improving the transportation experience.
So with that, I think it might be helpful for you to go through a couple of the initiatives that MARTA Army has championed over time, and then we can move on to sort of more of the why and the how behind what you're working on.
Sure. So one of the first ones I mentioned was TimelyTrip, which kind of transitioned into Adopt a Stop. And at MARTA Army, we try to focus a good bit on the bus experience, because so often people focus on rail, but MARTA is a transit system that's a feeder system. So the buses actually feed into rail. So buses are an integral part of the system. And so, you know, there are so many, MARTA has more than 10,000 bus stops, but not every bus stop is the same. And I'll talk about that also a little bit later. So if you are at a bus stop that doesn't have, it has the pole, right? So you know it's a MARTA bus stop, but you may not know what the bus number is, where the bus picks up, you know, where does that route go? What's the schedule? And so what we did was thousands of bus stops.
Saba, for those who are unfamiliar with the Atlanta system, that the bus stop you just described is a fairly common one to come across in the city of Atlanta. That there's a lot of stops that aren't shelters with a map on them necessarily, and real-time information.
Right. So, you know, a number of stops are not shelters, so they're standalone poles that are at the side of a street. And so you'll see a sign that says MARTA bus stop, but again, you don't know where it goes or what time it picks up. I mean, obviously there's the app, but if you don't have a smartphone, or if you're just not, you know, if you just don't know to download the MARTA app, you're a bit lost and not sure where to start. And we found this as an issue even for people who took trains all the time, but didn't necessarily know or were comfortable with how to take a bus. And so Adopt a Stop was a way to fix that situation, fix that issue. So what we did was, on the left, you'll see this, the schedule and route information. And so we created this on our own. We asked people to adopt the stop closest to them. So that could be the stop outside your house, the stop closest to the grocery store that you shop at all the time. And we printed out these signs, laminated them, and gave people zip ties. This was a very, kind of guerrilla type tactic, and put them out on stops, right? So this was a way for folks to know, okay, maybe I'm more comfortable taking the 39 because now I know where it goes and I know what time it's going to come. And I'm not freaking out if, the bus is a couple of minutes late. So it just gives people an added layer of comfort with the system, and it makes the experience that all the more easy, right? I mean, if you think about some of your favorite products, whether it's a physical product or a website, an app, like what is it about that you enjoy? And I bet one of the top things is how intuitive and easy it is. And so it's important for transit to also be intuitive and user-friendly and easy, right? I talked about bringing dignity to the transit experience. So if you do that, you're much more likely to get people on the system.
Excellent. So that was, as you said, one of the first initiatives you guys worked on, and then moving forward, and it was a fairly boots on the ground, lots of volunteers. As I recall, all that was needed was really printing, laminating, and then a whole bunch of MARTA Army members poking holes and handing out zip ties.
That's right. Yeah. So we just go ahead.
So since then, you've kind of evolved to some of your projects, and so now there's even a Bus Stop Census project and some other projects also that are more organized, working with MARTA. Can you talk about a couple of those as well?
Yeah, so I'll briefly talk about this. This is one that's underway right now. Again, I was talking about the current bus stop standard is different across the system. So some, like the picture that's on the lower right, there's a shelter, it's well lit, there's a sidewalk, there's grass. It's very easy and convenient for someone to use. And then you have other stops that are like the one on the top, where there's a rail station. You're exposed to not only the rail, but you're also exposed to cars, and it's just not a comfortable experience, right? And so we wanted to catalog at least a quarter of those stops, right? And so we just asked the public. We started this before COVID, and now we've moved into encouraging people to just do it from the comfort of their home using Google Maps. And so we had a list of about 15 questions about the bus stop. So is it well lit? Is there a crosswalk? Is there a trash can? Could an elderly person be comfortable at that location? Could a teenager or even a 10-year-old be comfortable, right? A mom with kids, someone with groceries. So what is that experience holistically at that stop? And then what we're going to do with that data is share it not only with MARTA, but we're also sharing it with the local public works officials. And that's because, as of the other agencies, MARTA doesn't own that property where the bus stop is, right? And so this it's mutually beneficial. So it helps the public works department or that city or county to say, okay, there are a number of bus stops in my area that aren't providing an optimal experience. So as a city or as a county, how do I want to improve that, right? So maybe that means we need to accelerate sidewalk programs, or we need to introduce trash cans, right? Or we need to add more lighting. The agency alone can't take all of that, right? It has to be in partnership with the city. And then for MARTA, it helps them internally. They've been having a conversation about cataloging their own bus stops, right? And so this gives them some preliminary data as they go about doing that in the future.
That's excellent. So there's some good questions coming in, and I think this might it'll be a question that I can transition also into another one of your initiatives. Can you talk a little bit about how MARTA Army is funded and what the cost needs are? Because there are some projects like the Bus Stop Census that, if you have volunteers, you said, sitting at home in their living room and they know their bus stop and they can check some things on Google Maps, that's maybe a lower budget initiative, but then some of your other initiatives, like providing trash cans at bus stops, or some of the ones that you haven't quite gotten to yet, those are a little more costly. So
Right.
how do you decide what to do and find those budgets and you know, the difficult part, getting the money?
Yeah, so I'm gonna transition to this one to give an example of how we pull some of these things off. So we are, just to give everyone context, we are all volunteer led. It's a 5-member board. Everyone has full-time jobs. Some people are married with kids, and we find a way to do it, right? And so it's about how do we tackle the pressing issues of the day? So we're all in the middle of COVID. You know, one thing we wanted to do was find a way to support furloughed transit workers, right? There were about, I think, 3/4 of the mobility workers, which paratransit, were furloughed. And so we're like, how do we do it? I was like, well, why don't we maybe provide like drop off pizzas to the garages, or, you know, do something. And then we calculated, okay, what would be the cost to provide a $10 meal to 300 people? And then we're like, oh, that's a lot of money. And so what we did was just got really creative. So I reached out to a local chef and said, hey, Hugh Atchison, who some of you all might know because I think he's been on some of those chef shows. I said, hey, what would it cost if we, you know, worked with you guys to provide meals? And he said, oh, actually, why don't I put you in touch with World Central Kitchen? They're already doing this. You don't have to pay anything. And so what we do is A, try to collaborate and find partnerships, and then B, you know, fundraise just like any other organization would, right? And so we have to be nimble and fast, because that's the only way these kinds of operations happen, right? So I'm a consultant to MARTA, and so I see on the, you know, internally, sometimes how slow things have to move, and then externally with MARTA Army, we try to find how fast. I mean, it's all about rapid action, and we kind of take that, not to sound too militaristic, but we kind of take that approach of, you know, almost like an insurgency strategy kind of thing, where you go fast, you iterate, you see, okay, this didn't work, all right, let's try plan B, right? I mean, one thing we did as a very short operation, it was short-lived, but it was a fail, and then we iterated into something else. And that was something called Operation Save a Bed. And that was, again, in the middle of COVID, we were trying to figure out, you know, a lot of people are speeding on neighborhood streets right now because there's just less traffic. You know, what if we do something called Operation Save a Bed, and people put out a sign in their front yard that says, slow down, save a bed, because we can't afford having people go to the hospital for, you know, being hit by a car when there are tons of COVID patients that are also in the hospital, right? So it didn't pan out, but then we immediately pivoted to the next thing. And so for both an agency and a potential organization like the MARTA Army, you have to be willing to have failure, because failure is going to bring progress.
And do you feel like you maybe as MARTA Army have a little bit more latitude to fail than if MARTA as an institution was doing it themselves?
Yes, but I also think an institution has latitude to fail if they communicate, right? Mm-hmm. So, and it's all about building relationships and trust early, right? I'm a big believer in building relationships before you need them. And so and the public is far more forgiving than I think sometimes agencies realize, right? So it's all about how you communicate and say, hey, we want to try this. You know, oftentimes I'll see like, well, MARTA or other organizations will say, we're going to do a pilot, right? Let's just try this for 3 months or 1 month and see if it works. But you can't be afraid to fail, because if you're afraid to fail, that means you're never going to innovate. And if you don't innovate, you'll be stagnant, and no one can afford to be stagnant.
That's the definition of risk, right? There's a possibility that you'll get the non-optimal outcome as well.
Right. Right. And then it's important because it might also, you'll uncover something in that failure that will lead to a success in another project.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So you've talked a little bit about your relationship with the MARTA staff and working with the board and the CEO and people at the agency. There's a couple questions here about the difficulties of labor and unions with transit agencies. So is that something that you have encountered at all? And as an outside coming in and trying to work in transit, how has that relationship or those conversations gone?
Yeah, and that actually came up through Feed an Operator, right? So originally we were hoping to partner directly with the agency on it, but it was taking a little bit too long. And so we pivoted to directly work with the union, right? And so the union kind of helped us get the first couple weeks together. They let the workers know about the program and the initiative. And then they also helped pass out information at the location. So it was mutually beneficial for the union as well, because it allowed them to interact with transit workers in a way that they wouldn't ordinarily. But it was also helpful because it allowed us to understand the union's dynamic, right? And so, one thing we were able to do was to help the union understand some issues that were happening internally. So as an example, right before we started Operation Feed an Operator, there had been some, public tension around if the workers were getting masks, PPEs. And what the union didn't realize was that MARTA had been trying to work with another vendor to get masks as fast as possible, but that hadn't been relayed, right? But I happened to have that inside knowledge, and so I shared it with the head of the union, and he was like, oh, I didn't even realize that, right? And then on the other side, we were able to help them figure out some difficulties they were experiencing with middle management, right? So masks were delivered, but for some reason it wasn't going all the way through the pipeline. And so MARTA Army has been able to kind of hold this really interesting perch of not only bringing in the voice of the public, but then also kind of marrying the voice of the union with the agency.
Excellent. And I wonder also, one of the, you mentioned this idea of building relationships before you need that relationship or want to depend on somebody. And one of the other MARTA Army initiatives that started, way back at the beginning of the founding was the Marta Kudos initiative also, which engaged the operators. And do you think can you talk a little bit about that initiative also?
Sure.
And if you think there's a difference in that relationship?
Yeah. So this was another great way that we were able to work with the agency in a way that, again, was autonomous, but it helped the agency, overall. So we know there are a ton of frontline workers, even beyond COVID, who do a great job, right? And that customer experience makes all the difference, right? You remember a really bad customer experience, and you remember a really good customer experience. And so we wanted to highlight and showcase workers, right, the frontline MARTA staff who were doing really good. I mean, it could have been something like, and we crowdsourced all this information through social media and email, right? So we put out a call, hey, if you had a great MARTA customer experience, let us know, give kudos to that operator or to that station agent or whoever it was that helped you. And we did a kind of a formal awards ceremony, and it had never been done before. When we presented it to MARTA, they were like, wait, you want to do what? Think about it like, the Oscars for your transit workers. And it was just a really fun way to show that, A, the community cares and recognizes the value of public transit workers. And then B, to show that, that they're not in this alone, right? Like there is a community of people in that region, at the Metro Atlanta region, who truly care about the public transit experience and the people who are delivering the service that we all need.
Yeah, and you said at the beginning of answering that question, you said people remember the really good and the really bad. But I think most of us who are engaged in social media see a lot more of the complaining about the bad than the applauding the good. So
right.
Pushing
You're
people to engage, I think, is really important to make sure that that's heard as well. the overall perceptions of these agencies also have that positive feedback coming in and radiating out.
That's right. And it's really about taking a proactive approach, right? So in Metro Atlanta, although we are one of the top media markets in the country, public transportation and transportation even broadly is not talked about in the media, in the news as much as it should, right? It's either, you know, oh, a MARTA train was delayed because of a technical failure, or there's a referendum that's, you know, on the ballot in November. But there's not a lot of day-to-day, here are some great things that are happening in public transit, right? So I have a communications background and I do media training. And one of the things I always tell people in training is you don't see a newspaper headline that says plane landed safely, right? And so you have to be proactive in pushing out, you know, the initiatives and things that are going on, how the public can get involved. And again, build that groundswell of support, because the media landscape is changing, right? Transit agencies or no organization can rely solely on the media to get their message out or to receive information. And so you've got to be thoughtful and proactive about how to engage the public.
So how do you, in engaging the public, and you are one of the founding members of MARTA Army, and MARTA Army grew quickly. We started, there were what, five or six table, and now there's tons of people helping. So how do you find those people who are passionate about transit despite negativity? There are a lot of people who feel like, oh, this, there's all these problems, and how do you get them from recognizing those problems and complaining to wanting to be active and own, be part of the solution and getting out there and getting involved? How do you find the right people, and how do you get people involved in the right way?
So identifying quick wins, right? Everyone likes to be part of a winning organization or a winning team. And so you get a couple of quick wins under your belt, and so it just begets more and more engagement and action. I think B is building those community relationships, right? So the MARTA Army has a strong relationship with every transportation related organization in Metro Atlanta. And then not only that, but we even expand beyond transportation because we know housing and transportation are so aligned. And then another thing we've done really well, and it really is, I have to thank Simon Barabee because he's the one who really pulled this together, is a strong relationship with an academic institution. So Georgia Tech, we have a very strong relationship with, as well as Georgia State. And so we were able to tap into, undergrad, grad, and PhD students who are already studying this and looking at this and wanted a way to take, the theory of what they learn and turn it into action. And that has been a very impactful way that we have grown.
Excellent. Well, we only have a couple of more minutes, so I was wondering if you want to talk, and there's a lot of questions coming in still, and so we'll make sure for all of our listeners that we are going to post Saba's slides and a video of this webinar, and we are going to share the questions that weren't gotten to with Saba to follow up afterwards as well. But I just kind of wanted to end with you, Saba, and sort of what's MARTA Army doing now? What's next? And any advice?
Sure. So I just want to highlight this quote from Dr. Kari Watkins, who's a professor at Georgia Tech, and I'm sure a lot of you all know in the transportation world, the purpose of MARTA Army is to understand that it is your agency, it's your organization, right? And then on the agency side, it's understanding that there's only so much we can do, right? An agency has an incredible amount of demands, political demands, ridership demands. I mean, there's just a lot, especially in, an area like Metro Atlanta, where sometimes there's a disconnect between the state and the region and the city when it comes to transportation, right? So to get to your question of what's one thing that we're working on right now. So Monday, so just a few days, we are working with the agency to launch Mask for MARTA. This is led entirely by MARTA. They just asked us to volunteer and help support. And again, they were able to do this because of the relationships that we have built with them over the years. And so it's a free mass distribution across the system. You know, as you all know, Georgia numbers are increasing, and it's a concern. And so we want to make sure that even as this happens, that public transportation is still seen as necessary, as safe. And so it's very important for us to be part of this. And so our volunteers are working on it, but it's not just us. We've also looped in some of those organizations you heard about before, you know, bicycle, pedestrian, and other community groups to say, hey, if you care about MARTA and you care about the people who use the system, you know, participate in this mass program. So we're going to be essentially kind of MARTA ambassadors, Team MARTA folks at the stations and at the bus bays passing out free masks. So that's one that is hot off the press and starting Monday.
That's great. And I think that really does highlight sort of the versatile role that MARTA Army has placed themselves in, that, you know, there's MARTA Army-led initiatives, there's MARTA-led initiatives, there's a trust between the organization and the agency, and good communication, and that really seems to be the foundation of what's helped MARTA Army grow and build and be productive.
Right. I would just want to leave with this call to action, both for agencies and for others who are listening. You know, even if you work for one of the engineering firms, right? So it doesn't have to even be an agency person. If you are a resident of a city, county, state, you have an ownership stake in the transportation experience, right? And so you can't just say, oh, that's not my job. That just doesn't work these days, right? You've got to be at the table and move the needle and change the narrative about what transportation is and what it can be. I think COVID has shown us that, you know, status quo won't work, right? There's a new normal that is happening, and it's up to agencies to say, we are going to invite the public. We are going to be very thoughtful and methodical and bold about what the public transportation experience is. And then it's up to the public to say, hey, we have the power, right? So just like in an election, you vote for who your elected official is, and that's your representation, right? On the public transit side, you don't have that, but that doesn't mean that you don't have the power to say, why can't I have a really funky bus stop that has, you know, that's painted by some cool artist, right? So it's not a question, it's, you know, MARTA Army asked the question of why not?
A positive way to move forward. Great. Well, thank you so much, Saba. Thank you for sharing. And as I said, her contact information, the slides are going to be up on our website at enotrans.org, where you can also find any number of policy reports written by Eno and Eno Transportation Weekly, which is our weekly newsletter on all things transportation. Our next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, July 14th, and it's going to be talking about voluntary safety assessments and automated vehicles and public policy. So please look into joining us then. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much, Saba, for your time and insights with us. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, stay engaged.
Yes.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Take care.